Welcome everyone here and on the WebEx to Brown Bag seminar jointly hosted by Delta Science Program, Ecosystem Restoration Program, and Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. And today we have the seminar as Delta as Place, Yesterday and Today, and this is a part of the series on the Delta Narrative Project. And today's presenter is Dr. Robert Benedetti and Dr. Jennifer Helzer. So the Delta Narrative Project, supported by Delta Protection Commission, is a collaborative project involving regional academic and cultural institutions to communicate the historic cultural importance of the Delta region in California's and America's history through multi-format educational exhibits within and around the Delta. And the webpage is shown on the screen. So Dr. Robert Benedetti is a political scientist and co-associate director of the Delta Narrative Project. And he is currently an emeritus faculty of University of the Pacific, and also he's a co-associate director of the Delta Narrative Project. And currently he also works for CSU Sacramento as adjunct faculty, Center for California Studies. And the second presenter is Dr. Jennifer Helzer. She's a cultural geographer, and after she got a PhD at University of Texas, she works for CSU Stanislaus in the Department of Anthropology and Geography, and she's a professor of geography. So without any more time taking for introduction, let's start the presentation. So please welcome Dr. Helzer.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out today to the Brown Bag. And as was mentioned, this is the third in the series, and my focus today is going to be looking at some of the cultural heritage and ethnic groups that are associated with the Delta. Oops, we need to get that fixed. Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, this is actually part one, sorry, or the slip up in the slide. Okay, so in the 1950s, powerful economic, political, and social forces precipitated momentous change in the Delta. The California Gold Rush, levee construction, which I know you heard about in a previous discussion, agricultural development, and the migration and settlement of domestic, European, and Asian cultural groups. The map here is a newspaper, a historic newspaper from the map collection. It's David Rumsey Map Collection that highlights what people were seeing as routes to California during the gold rush period. And you can see in yellow here this Delta region kind of included here with the gold-bearing region up in the Mother Lode area. And it's depicting different routes to the gold fields, different ways for people from all over the world, emphasizing this important, momentous event. The Great Migration linked to California's gold rush, the Great Migration linked to California's gold rush is purported to be the largest movement of people to a single area in North America. Other areas have comparable numbers associated with their frontier migration, but California's distinctiveness lies in the rapidity of frontier migration. Moreover, the region's settlement was complicated by Hispanic colonizers' topographic features that restricted their movement into and settlement of certain areas in California. There were some ranches that were established during this early period of the gold rush, and immediately thereafter, the population growth in the Delta was mostly focused on two towns that supplied the miners, Stockton and Sacramento. Other urban areas were mostly the result of transit stops along the waterway from San Francisco, and I believe you heard a little bit about that from last week, or the last presentation on transportation. It was the arrival of subsequent immigrant groups that provided the stimulus for the founding of new Delta communities that were organized around ethnic bonds and the economic needs of this emerging agricultural region. Sorry. Okay, nope. All right, where's back? There we go, okay. As the opportunities for gold receded, the inhabitable lands of the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys proved enticing to settlers. Diverse cultures formed distinct communities during the Delta's land reclamation phase and subsequent agricultural development. The family farm, which was long been a part of the American myth and reality, was in evidence during this period, as exemplified here in Levi Painter's farm near the town of Cortland in the Delta. But it was the small corporate farming and agribusiness that significantly shaped the region's history. Only corporate partners could afford reclamation and the equipment, like the clamshell dredge listed here, pictured here, made it necessary, or equipment like this necessary for the success of the Delta's unique agricultural landscape. Much of the urban development in the Delta is tied to its labor history and the role that different ethnic communities played in providing both a skilled and unskilled workforce to complement the capital investment of corporate industry. The close association between the requirements of a labor force and the development of communities resulted in trends that ultimately weakened community bonds. Agricultural workers were low paid and they had little time or money to invest in civic activities. Norms that enforced separation, even segregation between races and cultures divided communities and denied them the critical mass necessary to prosper. Further, the access of Delta laborers to housing in Stockton and even Sacramento meant that there was an alternative to living in smaller Delta towns. As a result, urban centers in the Delta were boom and bust, prospering as long as a particular industry with particular needs was flourishing, only to fade when the industry declined or changed. In the post-gold rush era, Chinese laborers were the first among the newcomers to arrive in the Delta, and what you're looking at here is one of the map. It's a Sanborn fire map. You can find these for every city, small and large. They're really useful for historical geographers and cultural geographers and others to try to understand what the enclaves were like at that time. They list things, in this case, they have Chinese restaurants listed, they have gambling houses, drugstores, different kinds of dwellings, and all sorts of even social activities you can come to understand by looking at these maps. So Sacramento and Stockton had early Chinatowns, like the one depicted here. They were important recruitment centers for Delta laborers. Individual landowners in the Delta and land corporations utilized a system of contract labor to hire Chinese laborers, and they made significant contributions to levee construction. They're estimated to have reclaimed at least 88,000 acres of the Delta between 1860 and 1880. I also have a picture here of a tule shoe. This was an invention by Chinese laborers in the 1850s that helped them to build the levees. In a lot of our work that we did for the project, we were fortunate to meet with many archivists in different museums, and they found items that were really interesting for us to incorporate into various presentations in our work. So the tule shoe is an oversized horseshoe, and this is what the horses, prior to having these, there were stories apparently of the horses getting stuck in doing the land reclamation, and so kind of an important invention and interesting kind of icon to think about the work that was done there. The Chinese played a major role in Delta agriculture. Immigrant farmers specialized in orchard work. There are actually two main dialect groups from China. They actually didn't associate with one another too much, either in Stockton or in the Delta. The picture here taken by Roger Minnick is entitled Chang's Hands, and Mr. Chang was a long-time laborer in the pear orchards around the Cortland area, but the Chinese were really well known for their onion and potato crops, and there are famous stories of individuals who did very well. They weren't that familiar with asparagus, but they became experts rather quickly in growing and canning the new crop. And the produce label here just kind of identifying the importance of asparagus for the region, not only in California, but throughout the world. By the 1880s, the Chinese were 1/3 of the state's agricultural workforce. The focus, again, being one of the main areas of the Delta region. Exclusionary laws ultimately led to spatial isolation of the Chinese in the Delta and the development of Chinatowns. In addition, restrictions of migration made them less available for labor. So over time, there was a constriction on this particular group. There are some noteworthy places and spaces associated with the Chinese in the Delta. Locke being one of them. Maybe some of you are familiar with the town of Locke. One of the dialect groups, the Zhongshan, established this town in the early 1900s. It is the most complete example of Chinese-American rural community in the United States, and it was recognized with these two distinctions listed on the slide. This was a place in the 1920s. It was a lively hub of activity. It's thought that at its height, about 600 residents lived there. On weekends, the population doubled. The gambling houses were full. It had a movie theater, speakeasies, and even the nearby populations in some of the labor camps would make their way into Locke. By the late 1800s, the second wave of settlers arrived in the region to meet the agricultural demand. The Japanese moved into farming in great numbers and quickly progressed to secure long-term leases to grow high-value crops. They made important contributions to large-scale agricultural operations, including potato farming and cannery work. And the map that you're looking at here, it's a little hard to see. That's San Pablo Bay, Contra Costa County. Here's the Delta region. This map depicts, it was called, the title, Oriental Land Occupation map. It was kind of a provocative map. I'm using my mouse here. The colors in the map, the red is associated with Japanese land ownership. The green is Hindu/Sikh, and then the yellow Chinese. And so it was a map like this that really led, in some cases, to the Japanese being kind of marked for discrimination. It scared people, their land ownership, and how well that they were doing. Their success often made them the target of discriminatory policies, including the establishment of segregated schools in the Delta, and ultimately resulted in their forced relocation and incarceration during World War II in response to Executive Order 9066. Walnut Grove was one of 4 Sacramento County schools. These are examples of some of the places that were associated with this restriction to utilize the 1921 law enabling the establishments of segregated schools. These Oriental schools in the rural communities of Florin, Cortland, Isleton, and Walnut Grove reflected pervasive systems of racial discrimination. By the early 1920s, Walnut Grove's commercial sector had mushroomed to include hotels, boarding houses. There were 5 grocery stores, 8 restaurants, a barber shop, 2 drugstores, dry goods, even a soda bottling company. In addition to these local sales, this particular enclave, a good portion of their income came from delivering provisions to labor camps throughout the Delta. My colleague here, Bob Benedetti, when we started this project, he made sure that I put something about Collinsville in every presentation. And Southern Europeans, Italians and Greeks as well, and Portuguese, especially from the Azores, began to arrive in the Delta region in the late 1880s. Italians made significant contributions to truck farming and cherry growing, and they were also important innovators of mechanized farming equipment. They also developed important labeling and packaging advances that allowed the export of quality products from the region throughout the world. There were some, although, who came attracted to the potential for fishing and a trade that many had mastered in Italy, only met with some success for a short period of time, and the rise and fall of Collinsville that's depicted in these pictures is closely associated with commercial fishing as well. I can't guarantee that the photo in the lower left here, I picked this one up late last night. I know it's in the dunes. I'm not sure if it's Italians, but this idea of it being a community kind of place, Collinsville in the Antioch area as well, at least during this period of commercial fishing. Filipinos played a major role also in Delta farming, but they quickly settled in Stockton. It's really the focus of their settlement. The fact that many of the first immigrants were young and male may have been a determining factor in their choice of settlement. They wanted an urban lifestyle and to participate in the social activities of 1920s urban America. Their urban lifestyle was underwritten by hard labor in the Delta. At one time, Filipinos made up 90% of the asparagus harvesters in the Delta and worked under some of the most difficult conditions, labor conditions in the country. They used Stockton as a base, and they were often forced to move from one labor camp to another throughout the year. Both in Stockton and on the road, Filipinos were systematically exploited, and they faced many forms of mistreatment, including deplorable living conditions, corrupt hiring, and payroll practices. Subsequently, they were one of the first groups to become active in the farm labor movement, and they played a critical role in the United Farm Workers Union. I am bringing a class, my ethnic geography class, to Stockton next weekend, and so I was fortunate to visit the new Filipino Historical Society. I have the wrong name, but they are now opening up an exhibit in downtown Stockton. I encourage you to visit. They have a lot of artifacts, and they're very friendly. They want to bring you in. They're taking us on an entire tour of the downtown and looking at some of the older buildings and where the enclave was. And so these images are from the Little Manila Foundation, who's in charge of the museum, or the soon-to-be museum anyway. Sikhs, Punjabi Sikh immigrants also arrived in the Delta in the early 1900s. The region resembled their Punjabi homeland in northern India, and they found work in the Delta's orchards and field crops, and eventually expanded into leasing their own farmland. Like Filipinos, the Sikhs also settled in Stockton, where they built the first Sikh temple in the United States. In their case, religious identity, rather than a particular lifestyle, seems to have drawn them towards Stockton rather than the Delta settlement, and also to locations up north where they were able to buy land. The first Sikh Gurdwara is pictured here. They're having a major celebration next week. It's a focal point of the community, not just in Stockton, but for Sikhs in our region. After the 1920s, Delta farmers faced significant labor shortages that included the impact of exclusionary policies, the loss of workers to World War II who were drawn to shipbuilding and other factory jobs. They essentially left the fields, and especially those in the Delta. During the war years, the Delta region became an epicenter for the Bracero program that was initially driven by the demand for agricultural laborers to harvest sugar beets and orchard crops in the region. Lobbying efforts by growers helped to extend the program after the war ended, and these laborers were often migratory until changes in immigration laws. They frequently went back to Mexico for part of the year. So it's another story yet of a group that doesn't have a foothold in the Delta. They didn't make an impact on the Delta communities as some of the earlier groups who had elected to stay. The first installment of the Bracero program actually occurred in Stockton, where 500 Braceros arrived to harvest sugar beets. So the significance of the photo here is that we're looking at a field that is harvested with something called El Cortito, or the short one, the hoe. It's an icon of of one of our narratives, but also of the injustice and abuse that occurred in the fields. It's representative of the wrongs practiced on Mexican field laborers. The hoe measures about anywhere from 12 to 18 feet, and it's designed particularly for sugar beets, for weeding and the other the weeding and also piling up of the soil around the beets. And people were bent over, stooped over all day weeding rows of sugar beets. The laborers who did this work have lifelong injuries, mainly back injuries, and it became kind of a rallying point for the United Farm Workers in their efforts to demand better working conditions. The short-handled hoe was finally banned for use in California in 1975. It took a while. Throughout history, the Delta has been a crossroads and a place of environmental change and agricultural fortune and a destination for newcomers. The Delta's agricultural development drew ethnic laborers to its edge cities, these places of work for short-term settlement and occasionally entertainment, as the example with Locke. But these were temporary communities because they were not tied to conventional work patterns in the development of traditional cities. In more recent times, the Delta has been home to a particularly transient type of immigrant, the visitor looking for short-term recreation and respite, where ethnic communities were often too small to become viable or to continue once a main industry failed. Urban dwellers seeking isolation or retreat in the Delta hideaways long for the small town ambience that the Delta provides. There are numerous vignettes, especially by Earl Stanley Gardner, that illustrate the special urban, the nature of these urban refugees and how they come to enjoy the towns that remain in the Delta today. The tranquil setting of the Delta and its proximity to major population centers in the Bay Area and the Central Valley have drawn people to dawdle, temporarily dwell, and even hide out in the region. Fishermen, retirees, boating enthusiasts, and other sportsman communities have colonized the Delta islands and sloughs with cabins, cottages, and boat docks. The marinas and their destinations have exotic names like Lost Isle, Tiki Lagoon, or Pirate's Lair that create a landscape of adventure and a Delta playground for boaters. The orchards, bird life, and pastoral scenery also provide an oasis for urban refugees. Today, the Delta communities serve as an emerging urban clusters that lie on the outside of major urban realms. The map on the left is the one that we created for our project. It highlights, it tries to really emphasize many of the different narratives, the transportation networks and the linkages between those, both historic and present day, and really highlighting some of the communities that were the focus of our work. The map on the right isn't meant really for trying to read any of the fine print, only to see sort of the encroachment of the urban areas that are starting to surround the Delta. And as I was driving in from Turlock today and kind of going over this talk in my mind, I was thinking about the different off-ramps. I think of them as off-ramps, but they're kind of connective pieces to the Delta. And so I think thinking about the Delta as a new kind of edge city might be worth thinking about. So I think now my colleague maybe has a few words to say about that. Do you want me to change this, Bob?
Yeah.
I want to. Do you want to do? I don't know. time I touched it, I would.
My name is Bob Benedetti, and I'm a political scientist. I have also been very interested in small communities. I study state and local politics, particularly local politics, and that's led me into interdisciplinary things, particularly in the humanities and other social sciences, to try to get some idea for what it's like to live in these places. And the concept, which now actually is in some of the Delta legislation, that I want to focus on today is a sense of place. What is it? What is the sense of place in the Delta? And I want to suggest that that sense of place has changed over time. And what makes the Delta so interesting is that the time frame is something on the order of 10,000 years. It's not a place in which people have just come recently. So to start off, this is very accessible. This is Wikipedia. They tell you everything. This is their definition of a sense of place. What's interesting about that concept is that it's essentially the way in which people themselves define an environment. It's not the environment itself in some sort of platonic whole. It's the way people look at it and how they define it. It's usually not only a natural environment, but also is wrapped into the social environment, the way they relate to each other living there. So it's a combination of natural and cultural features. So it's something that is imposed but has an echo in the natural environment. And what I'm going to be talking about today is that sense of place and how it changed in the Delta. Let's see here. This is it. Down this one. That's, oh, thank you. All right. Some of you may know the work of Laura Cunningham. She's an artist, and she recreates California's landscape before any people from the West saw it, at a time in which Native Americans lived here. The estimation is that there were Native Americans in the Central Valley somewhere between 10,000 and 8,000 years. Different groups came through. This particular group is one of the last ones, one of the groups that the Spanish would have contacted. This is a Miwok village. And what's interesting here is that she's tried to capture what I'm calling a sense of place. The Miwok were very interested in integration with the animal kingdom. They saw themselves as fellow travelers with the animals of the area, and most of their religious myths relate to animals. And in fact, during a flood-like situation where all the humans are wiped out in the valley area, it is the coyote and a few other animals that bring them back. So the animals have the power to recreate human beings, evolution, if you want, going the other way. Here, the bird life of the Delta is shown as very significant, as it was to the Native Americans. The fact that they lived near a major waterway because of the richness of the fish that they lived on, and the presence of the oak trees. I'm sure we all learned as children that they ate acorns. What I think we forget is that the acorns were simply a complement to the bird life and the fish life, which was very, very rich in the area. So their sense of place was really as an Eden, as a wonderful place that as long as they worked in concert with the animals who may have recreated them, that this was going to be for a long time a wonderful existence. And it was so wonderful that they could get on with their neighbors, even though I believe that the final count was 325 different languages were spoken in the Delta region. Right, so you had people next to each other that had no idea what the other one was saying. But because the area was so rich, there didn't seem to be the kind of conflicts that you'd normally expect with that kind of diversity living cheek to jowl. it's also an interesting example of ethnic toleration, something that didn't always follow in the next generations when the West came in the area. The Spanish came later to California than I think most of us think. It was the latter part of the 18th century. They had the dates are the 1780s and 90s, where they had been in Florida. St. Augustine is founded, I believe, in 1516 or some such title. They'd been here, but not in California. When they came up the coast, it was often very confusing for them. It was a long time for them to find San Francisco Bay. And when they came, they weren't sure quite what they were going to do here. But our new saint, Winifred Sarah, helped them out with that and started to found missions, which were also supposed to be ways to produce raw materials, agricultural materials, for export. One thing I think we forget is that what the Spanish really did in America was export to the rest of the world, particularly the Manila galleons. They provided resources for those galleons, and also those galleons often stopped here on their way back from Manila, picked up stuff and took it down to Mexico and to other Spanish ports. So the Spanish trade was very important, and these were to be stopping places, which is one of the reasons that all of the missions were on the coast, or coastal areas, fairly close to the coast. But the other reason was that the Spanish found it very difficult to navigate into the Central Valley area in the Delta because of the swampy conditions. They, in fact, did not go there initially to recruit Native Americans. The Native Americans were curious and came to them. But soon the relationship between the missions and the Native Americans soured, and a lot of Native Americans left to go back to their villages in the Delta area. Then the Spanish sent military to pick them back up so that they would have a continuing labor force. And when the military went in, they found it as a dangerous place. The Delta for the Spanish, as things evolved, it was a place not to go. It was hard to get through, and it was where the natives looked like this. This is a Spanish print, who were ready to get you. They were hiding behind supposedly every bush, and fearsome. So the Delta as a dangerous place, a place where you wouldn't go unless you absolutely had to, was the Spanish view of the Delta as time went on. The Spanish never figured out how to navigate the Delta. They certainly didn't see in the Delta what the next generation saw. For the people who came in the gold rush, and then later who stayed for agriculture, the Delta was a highway. It was there in order to get people from one place to another, basically from San Francisco to Stockton and Sacramento. And it was a very highly used highway. Particularly once steam came in, there were boats there all the time, taking people, Mark Twain among others, and all the goods and services, not only the gold, but once agriculture begins, all of the agricultural products. The train comes in a little later, so early on it was agricultural boating was used, and it was a primary service, a primary way to go around the Delta and into San Francisco until the 30s. So you can say you have almost 75 years of this being a highway. Now, on highway, we have rest stops. And one of the things that the communities that Jennifer talked about were the rest stops. They were places for visitors to come on and get off if they had business there. They were places for goods to be brought and put on a wharf so they could be picked up. There were places to get a drink or go out and take a walk before you got from San Francisco up to Sacramento. They were a place for the steamboats to get extra supplies to keep the steam running. Now, the steamboat didn't go, that vision of highway really doesn't go away until the 30s. But another vision of the Delta starts to grow really because initially of the federal government. The federal government made it very available to states to reclaim swampland. And though early on the state was going to do it and it wasn't sure quite how to do it, it finally let private people get involved in the project. And they reclaimed a great deal of Delta land. First, they did it by having Chinese laborers dig the levees, but those passed away very quickly because they were piling peat on peat. And once they decided to use the clam diggers that you've seen and Bill Swaggerty talked about, they were able to build canals that would rival Venice, things that would last because they were digging into the clay substratum and using that to build the levees. So the idea was that because they now had these clam diggers to do this, they could create something which would be an ideal agricultural paradise where almost anything would grow. The other thing they needed, though, which they didn't get until the turn of the century, was some way to go through the Delta and plow the fields efficiently. And that's when Mr. Holt came through with the tractor, the Caterpillar tractor, which I'm sure all of you know was invented in Stockton. They moved to Peoria, Illinois, because it was a better place to distribute it all over the world, particularly all over the United States initially. But it was developed because it could be used in the Delta. And one of the things that was wonderful about the Delta is you could change your crops very quickly dependent on the market. So they started in wheat, and when that wasn't any longer something that they needed to have, they could do anything else, and did. But the trick was to have technology to keep the levees where you wanted them, and have things like tractors to plow the fields. Soon, one other thing that you can vaguely see in this slide, I may be able to point it out, it's right here, is the truck. One of the reasons that Delta was really blossomed and people felt it was the future of agricultural life in California was that it was hard to get trains out there, and you had to go to the trains just like to the boats. But once the truck came in, they could package things there and very quickly get them out of the Delta. And so the idea that you had technology would create for you the ideal growing place, wonderful climate, water is plentiful, great soil, and you can get it in and get it out real quick. This, by the way, is from the Byron Times, which was a newspaper that's gone out of existence, and I think in part because its view of the Delta as an agricultural paradise started to wane during the Second World War. So what did it become? Well, Jennifer starts to recognize this. This is a page out of one of Earl Stanley Gardner's books. What it became was a place of escape. There had been some difficulties keeping up with the world markets in terms of agriculture, and while it was still there, it wasn't as plentiful as it had been. There were other places in California that were doing very well in agriculture, particularly in Kern County and in the rest of the valley. So agriculture kept up, but there were a lot of other places. It was also had become used by the military, and as the military withdrew, those towns and places where the military were no longer viable. As I think some of you know, our Guantanamo for the Second World War was in the Delta and Byron. And so it became a place for people to get away from it all, from the pressure of the Bay Area. And so all of the activities, the fishing, the hunting, but also people who were in the 30s who were running speakeasies and were fearful of getting caught in Oakland would move to Rio Vista and because they thought maybe they could avoid detection. And in fact, many of them did. I see it as a place where people who had enjoyed their fraternity life in college could keep it up in the Delta. And that brings us really to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What's the Delta's image now? And I would suggest it's something that the Delta really isn't, but we have imposed on it. It's either a reservoir or it's a habitat. And in fact, the reservoir and habitat, it really isn't a reservoir. It was never meant to be. It was a pass-through for water. And secondly, it was a habitat. Yes, it's always been a habitat, but much of the habitat we know now was created because of the way we dug the canals or the levees. It wasn't always that way. And in fact, in geological time, the Delta is a relatively new creation. But I think at our time, our sense of place of it is very well captured in this photograph. It's a beautiful place with beautiful sunsets where you may see around the edges a little bit of civilization, but you see a lot of water being held. So what's my takeaway on this? It seems to me that one of the things that we learn from looking at Delta history is the way in which human beings interact with nature and in which that relationship changes because of the way human beings impose their definition on nature. And because we have a run of 10,000 years, we have a wonderful example of history where nature is one of the actors, but so are different people. It isn't a place where nature hasn't changed and hasn't played a role, but it's also a place where the people have redefined it over time. And it's for that reason that we felt in the Delta Narratives Project that this was a history worth preserving and talking about. In many ways, it echoes other aspects of California history, but one of the wonderful things out there is you can still see it. You can still see segregated schools. You can still see the attempt to apply technology to agriculture. You can still see the areas in which the Miwok built their villages and their expectation for the richness of the environment and its support of them. So it's a place worth valuing not only for its natural resources and as a conveyance of water from one part of the state to another, but because it encapsulates the history of California. So we come up here and we want to ask this question.
So is there any question? And people on the WebEx can also type in the chat box for questions.
If not, we have a shill in the audience. We can ask Blake to give us a question. Blake is from the Delta Protection Division, funded this project. I did give to the Stewardship Council for the library hard copy of our final report, which has 4 essays. You're getting traces of those essays that you saw, as well as the final report.
What is your sense of place of the Delta?
Let's see here. I guess it's this one. I assume you all were working on the Delta. That's your job, right?
So okay, and I asked the question. So for me, I moved into California like recently, not recent, but just the past few years. Well, and also work for the Delta Stewardship Council, so I know a lot more about the history. But as like what I've seen, Delta is mostly recreational, like camping, fishing, and boating. That's how I see the Delta. Well, besides my professional areas, like water transfer and stuff.
So it's one big Puerto Vallarta or something like that, right? Or a place where people go for vacation. But it is interesting who goes. It has been my observation out there that it is our parents' generation. It's an older person or a person from the rural areas, people who like to fish and hunt, where a lot of the students that I taught at Pacific are not fishermen in the country. That's vacation. And boats aren't really what they were. I lived in Florida a long time, and everybody liked to water ski. I see that as popular these days. So I wonder which generation it is that goes out there and bags a few birds and then goes to Al the Wop for a drink. That's Lock, for those of you who don't know, frequent it.
We actually have a question from online. So what was the most surprising thing you learned in the course of this project?
Bob's making me go first. Okay. Well, I'm from California, and I'm from Northern California, so the hunting and the fishing and the water skiing and some of the things we've talked about, recreation, are things I grew up with. But I guess I always associated them with the place that was most familiar to me, and that was Redding and the area around it. And so I didn't know much about the Delta, and I suspect even as a native Californian that that's kind of the case for many people. I'm drawn to it more. I don't know if this was a surprise, but I want to go there. I'm probably going to try to figure out how to go there on the way home. I'm not sure which route, though, which is always kind of maybe another way we experience the Delta is which part, what am I going to see, how to stop. So I think I think of it in terms of how to learn more, which is not, maybe that's the surprise, that we've barely scratched the surface. And I'm interested to see in how it changes in the next few years. I've lived in the Valley now for 15 years, and places have really changed, and sort of to witness another place go through and have all the attention that it has politically. So I'm not sure it's a surprise as much as an interest, a continuing interest in the region.
Well, I was born in San Francisco, grew up here and left at 17 and was away for 30 years. And I think I expected the Delta would be much more developed when I came back because of what had happened to the rest of California. I still remember fruit trees in Santa Clara Valley. And when you went over to Pleasanton and Livermore, that they were quaint little towns. And so I thought that the Delta would be wrapped up in that. And what surprised me most is that it's in many ways a time warp. It's been kept out of that. And I'm not sure exactly why. Part of it is the way the freeways were cut, but they wouldn't have had to be cut that way. Actually, you could have connected 4 and made it into a direct route to San Francisco. Nobody ever did it. Was it an impossible engineering? My God, California engineers almost everything. We have the tallest dam in the United States. Maybe not the largest, that's Hoover, but Oroville is the tallest. We can do all of this stuff. Why not? It's as if people were circling it and leaving it alone. And that made it fascinating to me, more so than the mother lode, in which is becoming increasingly a retirement area, and also an escape area for groups that didn't like what's happening to the Bay Area, particularly people who have certain religious points of view who felt that in the 60s the Bay Area was not hospitable to them. But that's not the Delta. So I'm interested in how it has, in a way, protected itself or been avoided. And that really surprised me. I'm still really foxed that nobody is going to brave their definition of a sense of place. I would be interested in one question. How many of you, not in Sacramento, but starting in Freeport, live on the Delta? Any of you live out there? What? Give me kind of. Yes. Yes.
So that it's just outside
right,
of just outside of the
right.
secondary zone.
Because
yeah.
That's the other thing is I know very few people who commute from the Delta, even those that are easy like Cortland or Freeport. There's and I don't understand it. If in the earlier times living on the river would have been the thing, and I don't know is it somebody is fear of flooding. But you can get flooding anywhere around here. We're supposed to, after New Orleans, to be the next disaster area, and as I thought, it's covering this building. I mean, it's all the way. I'm lucky because I live right next to Sac State and has a little high area there over the American River, so I'm okay. But the rest of you are all flooded out. So, but I just don't understand. I mean, here Californians don't mind a commute. They think it's wonderful if they could live out in a wonderful place with a sunset like I showed, but that doesn't seem to happen very much.
Yeah, I can commute up I-5 or 99 very easily.
Not very hard. When I have had meetings on this, and we've gone, say, to Walnut Grove, and you turn off, you can get there very quickly, but it's like you're in a different world.
Yeah,
so,
I agree. My younger daughter did horseback riding for years out on the Delta. And I also, for my older daughter, going away party into the Army was held at Bethel Island. So I've always kind of like looked at the Delta as the recreation area. But I will say I'm from Central Illinois originally. That's where I grew up. And the area reminded me, when I first discovered it, very much of Central Illinois. So I've always kind of had that feeling towards the Delta myself from living down in that area.
It is, I would say, slower. It certainly doesn't echo the Bay Area, which everyone says is, you know, years ahead of everyone else and that sort of thing. It doesn't fit the definition of San Francisco or Northern California. It seems to be out of phase with it. But the sorts of things I'm saying have to do with sense of place, because I think it's not only the sense of place of the people in the Delta, which is what I tried to express here, but the sense of place of the rest of us who live around it. Because it's really one of, you know, Robert Frost had a little phrase he used quite a lot, which was that we all sit around and suppose, and the secret sits in the middle and knows. And I think that's what goes on in the Delta. We all sit around the outside and suppose about it, and it's there. But we don't know it very well, and maybe the fact you don't have a ready definition of a sense of place in there is because that's not the way you think about it. You do objectify it as a reservoir and a habitat, which is right now the way many people do it. But there's been other times, and that's not wholly the reason, the way people out there do it. In fact, I think that's part of the argument. I'm sure you noticed it. I was mentioning earlier on, I had an opportunity to reflect on Owens Valley recently and the situation in LA and there. And there's some real similarities between the Owens Valley relationship and the relationship between Kern County, LA, and the Delta. In that LA and Kern County make the argument, which is we are LA and we're as metropolitans. You've got to save us. And Kern County, we feed the United States. You know, this is big agriculture, and we take care of the U.S. Who are you to stand in the way of that? But that's not the way the people who live there, their sense of that place is that it's valuable enough to stand in its way. And I just think we need to figure out what that argument is from them so we hear it. Whether we ultimately agree with it or not, that's another question. But it seems to me it's one we have to hear. And it's a human argument. It has nothing to do with how many fish are in the stream or It has to do with human habitation and human definition of a place.
Okay, so it's 1 o'clock. So before we leave, next Brownback seminar is the fourth lecture or fourth seminar of the project. So we will have another Delta history seminar in December 7th. Okay. So then thank you very much, Dr. Helzer and Dr. Benedetti. That was a great talk.